Handicapper Steve here, handicapping the racing from Windsor Racecourse here on Monday. It is the 22nd of April 2024. Gonna look at the fifth race, the 620 from Windsor. But before I get on to that, remember to please follow me on Twitter at Horse Racing Kid 5 for more selections for race courses around the world, and I mean it around the world. Let's look at the fifth race, 620, which is the free digital race card at racedayready.com handicap. Class 4 handicap going for a $13,500 purse. Race for 4-year-olds and upwards. Horse rate 66 to 85. Field of 11 horses going 2,200 meters or mile 3/8 on the turf course. Going to take here the number 4 horse Way of Life as a top selection. 4-1-2 for me. In the trifecta, 4-1-2, trifecta, top selection of 4 horse Way of Life. This 6-year-old gelded by Havana Gold. Jonathan Portman trains one. Rob Hornby gets the mount. Horse hasn't been seen in about 7 weeks, 6-7 weeks. 2nd of March was his previous race at Kempton. Mile and a half on the poly track in a class for a handicap. He finished third by 2 1/4 lengths that day. I thought he wanted more ground that day. He got around the race course well from an inside poster, maybe just a little bit flat late, but it wasn't a world's worst race for him. His last 2 races haven't been half bad. Back to turf here today off some decent runs on the all-weather. Just not winning as of recently, but decent runs on the all-weather as of recently. I think he's due for a victory. He hasn't won in quite a few seasons. 2 back, 10th of February at Wolverhampton, a mile and a half in a class 4 handicap. He had a wide trip, which cost him. He finished second by a head. With all due respect, if he had a better poster, he probably would have won by open lengths, but he was drawn wide throughout. He had a bit of a turn of foot. He just couldn't keep up late. The other horse gamed him to the wire, but he ran his heart out that day. And then prior to that, on 23rd January, Southwell mile 3/8 in a class 4 amateur handicap. He finished second by 2 lengths that day. And again, he kind of yielded that day. Again, a wide poster I got to him there. And then a Kempton mile and a half in a class 4 apprentice handicap, finishing second by a half a length. Again, he just couldn't get there. He just was second best, which wasn't bad, but he just wasn't winning. Like I said, he's been close but no cigar as recently, refreshing here to the turf. I'll give him a shot. I think the one-horse composite for George Bowie and Hector Crouch and can get the job done was one of his last 2. 10th of January over the mile and 3/8 in the class 5 novice race at Kempton. It was quite nicely done, winning by 1.5 lengths. It was a little bit wide, but he got the job done being his lot that day. Probably that's why you haven't seen the horse since then. He had to be his lot that day. Probably took a lot out of him, but it was a very good, strong run. Right before Christmas over the mile and a half at Wolverhampton, the Class 5 maiden race, he won by 2 lengths that day, and again, staying the trip well. His races on debut at Huntington in a bumper, he ran okay. Came back to run over the flat where he had a decent third from a stupidly wide poster, but then really improved with those 2 races at Wolverhampton and Kempton. Refreshing here off the bench. Gonna have to overcome a wide poster, but I think he get the job done. 3-1, let's use him. To recap my selection now for the 620, the 5th race from Windsor, going to take the 4 horse Way of Life. Give kudos to the 1 horse composite. 4-1-2, trifecta, 4-1 in the quad pod. So good luck to him. Please follow me on Twitter at Horse Racing Kid 5. Good luck, everybody.